Hello again, and thank you for staying with us. We continue here. The Minister of Electricity and Energy, Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, is expected to meet City of Joburg officials about the city's electricity bill owed to Eskom. The city owes the power utility 4.9 billion rand in historic debt and 1.4 billion in current debt. Eskom has been threatening to cut off power to City of Joburg because of these unpaid bills. Joining us now is Mametlwe Sebei. He joins us from Union GIWUSA. Good to have you on the program, Mr. Sebei. Firstly, Eskom's threat to cut off electricity to the City of Joburg, as we've learned over unpaid bills, it could have widespread consequences here. How do you foresee this potentially affecting residents, particularly low-income households, but also workers who are already struggling under load shedding?
Absolutely. I mean, let's start with the law to start with, right? Firstly, this will be blatantly unlawful because you are dealing here with a public service in respect of which there is an obligation to provide a public service, including electricity, as part of the right enshrined in the Constitution, and in this instance is part of a right to an access to adequate housing. And I think the courts have pronounced themselves on these issues repeatedly. But also, municipalities do have an obligation to provide services in this respect, including electricity. But also, as you correctly point out, the impact to the workers is both as people who, like all of us, of course, do enjoy use of electricity in their own homes, to light their houses, to cook, and of course, basically to, for powering of the household. But also their jobs will be on the line because promotion of economic development means municipalities do have obligation to provide services, including water and electricity, which are essential for sustenance of economy, for sustenance of industries, and therefore jobs of the workers. And from that perspective, I think this is a dire situation and a threat that as workers we can't take lying low, and of course we'll have to challenge it.
Mr. Sebei, Eskom claims that the City of Joburg owes 6.3 billion rand, with about 4.9 billion of that being in arrears. Given that the city power and the municipality have raised issues around overbilling and issues such as mismanagement, how do you think these issues should be addressed to ensure fairness to both parties, but also ensure fairness to residents of Joburg?
I mean, there is intergovernmental, relation and dispute resolution mechanisms, right, that should be in place, that should be able to allow both Eskom and, City of Johannesburg to resolve these issues. The fact that there are allegations that, these parties don't participate in that, the fact that these issues, so far as I can see, they have been subject of courts, already is a failure for coordination at level of government. But I also think that it should be very clear, as I've said earlier on, courts have already ruled that Eskom cannot terminate electricity to residents simply on account of the failures of municipalities to pay. So there is that issue that I think remains unanswered, insofar as what Eskom contemplates doing in this respect, because we are entitled to these rights. And I think particularly in a situation wherein there's not even an allegation, by the way, that people who are going to be terminated are people who themselves are not paying. People are paying to municipalities. The issue is whether municipality is actually paying to Eskom. Now, there are two problems. Obviously, one is mismanagement of funds at the level of municipalities, but also is the fact that the tariffs at level of Eskom have become so unsustainable that what they are trying to do, and you just have to look at their current proposal for 36.15% increase that they are proposing. They are actually trying to squeeze, blood out of the stone, because the backs of the working class people are against the wall, and that is the reason that every single municipality in this country is owing Eskom. And I think the reality is, particularly those areas where you have working class constituents that is struggling even more and more to pay, in addition to a problem that I've highlighted. Now, that said, I think we've got to agree that government has an obligation to coordinate and to resolve the issues between themselves. The ministers must be able to intervene. As for the working class, we've got every right to insist that the failure at level of government should not affect the delivery of electricity as a basic right to which we are entitled. And I think failing which we've got to be able to organize, we've got to be able to resist this onslaught, because it is overall part of that whole neoliberal, policy framing that says municipalities must generate 90% of their income, which means they must generate it by taxing and imposing unsustainable tariffs for basic constitutional rights and public services on the poor and the working class. And that's the reason that we're here.
Let's speak about that. You speak about organizing or resisting such a move. How is GIWUSA or even other unions, how are you preparing to support workers who might be caught in the middle of this dispute, particularly those employed by City Power or other related entities who could face these job losses or even disruptions to their work?
Well, SAFTU is already in a course of convening shop steward councils everywhere. We have done ours as GIWUSA, and part of our mandate was to raise that with SAFTU, and I think SAFTU has also come to the same conclusion, because you are faced not only with these issues, but a whole range of other issues, including, labor law amendments, that are in place, but also the poverty wages that workers are earning. And I think what the austerity measures that were announced in recent budget do is to cut on the social wages of the workers. And I think, as I've said, the issue of electricity and, the debt to Eskom, which is very much part of the problem. I mean, I've seen somewhere the minister saying that this debt is going to reach about 6 trillion or whatever, but, huge amount from municipalities, right? And that just because, as I've said, right, the idea that services has to depend on the ability of ordinary people to pay is just not a serious proposition. In a country where there is over 12 million people who are employed, many of whom just don't have any income, many of the workers who are working, about 60% of them are on minimum wage that is somewhere between 4,500 and 5,000 rand. And just when you look at the cost of household food basket alone, is somewhere in the region of about 5,300. And that means that after spending on food, there is no money for electricity, there's no money for transport. In fact, in many ways, people do try to pay for electricity as a priority. But what then you have is that they are spending on food, but also municipalities use these monies to also try to patch on other areas of service delivery. And that's the reason that we are in this crisis. But the bottom line remains that the working class does not have to pay for the failures of the neoliberal policies and the austerity measures that this government seeks to impose. So we are going to be arguing as GIWUSA in the next coming shop steward councils, as per our mandate from our own shop steward council, to say that there has to be organization of the general strike, because the working class is faced with its onslaught, not only in respect of disruptions in access to electricity. If it wasn't because of load shedding, which we seem to be raining on now, it is now the issue of escalation in the cost of tariffs, which are overall part of the attacks which constitute a crisis of the cost of living for the working class in this country. So we need to mount a resistance, and I think this coming shop steward council for us will be the war councils of the working class, and would also be a prelude to convening of the working class summit, where we'll be also mobilizing community civics and other movements of the working class, including climate justice movement that we are calling to joining us, because we do believe that these issues relate to issues of energy justice, of climate justice, because we do believe that renewables in this situation are actually a way of providing an affordable, sustainable, cheap, and I think adequate, free, basic electricity to everybody in this country.
Mr. Sebei, as you'd know, there have been other voices raising issue over this dispute. Now, it has been escalating with, for instance, AfriForum and others calling for government intervention. What role do you think the South African government, both at national and provincial level, should play in really resolving this crisis, but also preventing further damage to residents and businesses as well who might be affected?
Well, government, the starting point is to, as I've said, reverse their whole neoliberal policy framework, which in this instance says that municipalities must fund services, must raise income from charging services that are meant to be rights to be enjoyed by everybody in this country, that are supposed to be a means of redistributing wealth and income in this country, particularly in the interest of the working class and the poor. But in the present situation, they are actually distributing wealth from the working class, from the poor to the rich. And that's the reason that we have a widening inequalities, as more and more working class people have to make a very tough decision between buying food for their families on the one hand, and of course, pay municipal bills. This can be accepted. And of course, that if it wasn't resolved by the ANC in the past 30 years, you are not going to have solution with this government of neoliberal unity, which, as I've argued consistently, it is a political conspiracy against the working class, a conspiracy of parties committed to more neoliberalism, and on the basis of which they want now a privatization of electricity generation, and that's part of the crisis. The reason that Eskom is partly in this problem is not just because of the strengthening by the coal suppliers, not just because of the strengthening by the so-called energy-intensive users that are enjoying special tariffs well below what I and you are paying for electricity. It's also having to do with, independent power producers procurement program, on the basis of which Eskom has outsourced, Eskom is privatizing generation of electricity. The end result of which, for instance, is a situation wherein Eskom is paying 15 billion in one instance, for instance, for a same amount of electricity that it would have otherwise generated at the cost of 3 billion. Is paying 15 billion to independent power producers. That is 5 times the cost of its own generation. And we are being made, as a working class, to pay for that. We are being made to subsidize the profit of these corporations that, of course, are profiteering from generation of electricity. And that's a problem. And the problem is that this government of national unity want to do more of that privatization. And that's the reason that part of our resistance has to go beyond the immediate attacks. It has got to speak to the political strategy. How do we take this government out? I think we've got to reach a point where we say, this is just not working. The idea that the poverty of the black working class can continue at the rate at which it is just totally unacceptable. We need fundamental change in this country. And I dare to say that we need revolution in this country. And this government has got to go.
Mr. Sebei, you quoted remarks made by the Energy Minister, Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, about this ballooning debt. But Eskom as well, has also cited that municipal debt is growing by 1 billion rand to 1.5 billion every month. In your view, what long-term reforms or even strategies should be implemented to prevent these kinds of disputes from becoming a recurring issue, if you will, for municipalities and residents as well?
Well, the case of Eskom is self-made, right? And I think in our submission to NESA, which we made last week, we're very clear. What are those costs? One, we argue that cancel the odious debt. It should be very obvious. A lot of that debt that Eskom has was actually accumulated during the years of the state capture. And whilst we have had a lot about prosecution, which are selective, factionalized, targeting RET faction of the ANC, and rightfully so, by the way, nonetheless, we say that the corruption was much broader than that. You have a situation where Hitachi, which was responsible for construction, I think, of Medupi, was successfully prosecuted in the USA, made to pay the USA government for corruption it committed in this country at Medupi against the people of this country. That can be acceptable. We can be made to pay for that debt. But I've also said that when you look at coal supply contracts, right? For supply contracts, Eskom is paying well above the cost of coal on global markets. And that's just because of a very corrupt relationship between Eskom and the people managing it, as well as, of course, Exxaro, Glencore, that have Exxaro, Siriti, and Glencore that have monopolized the coal supply of Eskom and so on. It is also about the energy-intensive users group that I've said in some instances, and that's the reason Eskom can never reveal those special tariffs that actually they're imposing, those contracts, because they know those contracts will make lots of South Africans very angry, because it means we are subsidizing big corporations at expense of the very working class and poor people that should be entitled to free and adequate electricity. I've already spoken about the IPPs, but also we are in a situation where we are in a country with an abundance of renewable energy resources whose cost at the moment is well below
what I may ask you to round up your thought as well, Mr. Sebei.
Yes, to generate electricity from coal, and the statistics are there. The only reason we're not having this transition is because of powerful corporate lobby and interest in the so-called mineral energy complex and their influence over government policy.